little bit of a back to the future moment in that I remember this is the big room in my mind. So I'm delighted to be back in the big room. And we're really, really pleased and grateful for everyone to make the effort to come across. Obviously, some folk, it's a longer travel than for others, but we've committed, I think, at least once annually to try to do this in person. And hopefully it'll made a discussion. There are some substantial items on the agenda for today. So thank you all for being here. This meeting is going to be recorded, not live streamed, but recorded. So please just be conscious of that. And hopefully, are we seeking everyone's permission, or is that well, is everyone okay with it being recorded? Okay, fabulous. So we'll make a start of the agenda if that's okay. So Emily, have we received any apologies for absence?
Yeah, we've received apologies for absence from Gavin Booth, Callum Clay, Heather Marks, Leah Mason, Amy Stancer and Peter Tomlinson.
Thank you very much. And it's Gavin's fault that I have to fill with my voice this afternoon, so you can pass on your thanks to him when you next see him.
Just to let you know, Heather Marks is here.
Sorry. Sorry. It's okay.
Thank you.
I mean, do members have any interests they wish to declare? No. Should any people on any the matters throughout the course of the day still have the right to declare that, so please do so. So we'll move on to agenda item 3 then. So minutes of the last meeting. I'd like to propose the minutes as correct record. Do I have a seconder? Thank you. And then all those in favour? Yes. Do we have any abstentions? Thank you very much. So moving on then to the substantive items of today's agenda. Item number 4 is school funding arrangements 24-25. And Lizzie, are you taking us through these? Fabulous. Can I hand over to you?
Certainly can. Good afternoon, everybody. In addition to your paper in your pack, you hopefully receive an update paper later this morning that I'll go through at some point during this paper. Just a brief background, you recall that we are now transitioning to the new hard formula, which will come into place in several years' time. But as a move towards that, all local authorities are required to bring their formula practice 10% closer to the national averages. And 2/3 of local authorities are now mirroring the national funding formula, including Lincolnshire. In 2024, we adopted a monthly value for national funding formula, but you recall there was again an issue with affordability in terms of increases in free school meals, and that was addressed through a reduction in our growth budget, a budget transfer from the school central services block, and a reduction in our ORP values. The table setting out the investment in the education sector is at page 30 in the report. In the October meeting, we provided an update on the provisional funding announcements for 24-25. Following that meeting, the DfE identified an error in their calculations. So although the overall funding pot remains the same, the factor values have reduced slightly from the October briefing paper, and that equates to a 0.8% per pupil reduction. The principles of DHB for 24-25 are the same as in previous years. There are 4 different blocks that make up our allocation, and an overall assessment of that is on page 14 of the report. We do also have a schools reorganisation policies that are available on our website. And one point to note that has been available in previous years is that the regulations now state that we have to have a minimum amount per child for that policy of 1550, and we are well above that amount. Turning to the Central School Services block now, that continues to form 2 elements, ongoing and historical commitments. And as in previous years, historical commitments funding is reducing by a further 20%, and we use that funding to finance our PFI schools building contracts. And we are continuing in discussions with the DfE regarding a sustainable solution while that contract remains in place. In terms of the higher needs block, the structure of fund is not changing. All local authorities have seen an increase in 3% per head. In order for Lincolnshire to receive that amount, we are going to be in receipt of protection funding of just over 7.5 million. In the October meeting, we discussed this modest increase and the financial impact this will have on the high needs block. The means and finance plan projections show the high needs block being in deficit in 24-25. And in the October meeting, we discussed the use of reserves to provide time to change and prevent DSG overspending in its entirety. There's no doubt the management of the high needs block is going to continue to be a financial challenge. In terms of early years, I won't go into too much detail because we do have a separate paper on this, but just to make members aware that there are 2 new childcare schemes coming into effect this year. In terms of our other funding streams, then we do have a number of grants that are continuing in 24-25. We have the pupil premium grant and the adequacy rates for 24-25 on page 18 of the report. Universal infant preschool meal rates have yet to be published for next academic year. Teachers' pay grant will continue the separate grant in 24-25, and those rates are detailed on page 19. There is going to be a new teachers' pension grant in 24-25 to provide financial assistance for the increase in employer contribution rates for teachers' pensions of 5%. We don't have any more information about that at the moment, but it's anticipated it will be a similar methodology to the TPAG in previous grants. So in terms of the DfG schools budgets, so as we discussed at previous meetings, we do intend to replicate subject to affordability, and the key points are on pages 19 and 20. There are a couple of things again I'd like to draw your attention to. First of all, as we said, because of the DfE error in loading all their calculations in the summer, the formula factors have now increased by 1.4%. Previously, that was advertised at 2.4%. And also to bring your attention to our primary rent factor. So the DfE require local authorities to make a disapplication request to continue using this factor. This factor funds schools who incur significant additional costs for the rental of school grounds or buildings that don't have those appropriate laws on site. And we can fund those if it's greater than 1% of the school's budget. At the time of writing the report, obviously we were still working through all information, so we now have 6 schools that will qualify, and that will be just under 0.069 million. And as part of the discussion at the end, we will be asking the forum to approve this application request to the DfE. Appendix A provides a comparison of national funding from the factor values from 23-24 to 24-25. The proposals to address affordability were initially discussed at the October meeting, and at the time of the writing report, officers were still working on affordability. Therefore, the proposals included in the paper were based on the modelling data. I'd now like to take you through some of the key points of dated data based on what we've been doing over the last few days. I would just point out, though, that we are sort of taking our final validation checks, so these things might change slightly, but we hope that there will be minimal changes. So, taking you through then this additional paper that we produced this morning, policy decision still remains to continue to adopt the formula subject to affordability. Again, in 24-25, we've seen a further increase in free school meals and free school meals over 6, and we believe this is put part duly to the cost of living crisis as a contributing factor. When we compare the data for free school meals from the October 23 to October 22 census, we've seen a 2.73% increase in the primary sector, but an 11.4% increase in the secondary sector, creating a cost pressure of £1.4 million. We've also seen some small increases in the second language and mobility. Part of those costs are offset by a minimum per pupil funding and minimum funding guarantee. So therefore, we have an affordability gap of 1.459 million. Adopt the national funding formula in its entirety, including an MFG of 0.5%. The local authority proposes to address this by 2 steps: to reduce our growth budget from 2.674 million to 1.438 million. The remaining budget of 1.236 will go towards the affordability gap. That then leaves us a shortfall of 0.223 million. The local authority proposes to reduce ORPU values by 0.072% to address that gap. Last year, we had to reduce the ORPU by 0.075, so a similar reduction as to last year. And the implications for the ORPU values are detailed on page 2 of your report. There's a little table 1 in there. So I've already referenced that as preparation to move to the hard formula, local authorities are deemed to be replicating the formula if our formula values are within plus or minus 2.5% of the national funding formula. So we are still mirroring it because we're at 0.072%. We consider a reduction in order to the fairest approach, as it will impact individual school levels, but they are very modest. Overall, they are 0.04% below government levels. And this decision will be subject to approval by the Executive Council of the Children's Services, Community Safety, Procurement and Migration. So in summary, in terms of affordability, We intend to continue to adopt all elements of the National Funding Formula as detailed in the main report and summarised on page 2 of this additional report. The only difference being that the OPU values will now be at 1.43% in monetary terms. So again, at the end, you'll be asked to note the contents of this element of the report, the recommendations in terms of adopting the formula by the steps identified, i.e. reducing the gross budget and a reduction in the OPU values. And also if you have any additional comments that we can pass on to Executive Councillor. Turning back to the main report, there are a number of budgets, essential budgets, that require schools form approval, and these start on page 24. So there are tables 4, 5, and 6, which I'll go through now. And in these tables, you will see we have a proposed budget for 24-25 and the previous budget for 23-24. So on page 24, table 4, this relates to the schools block, and these budgets can be set at any monetary value. So this budget relates to our gross budget, and it's so that the local authority can fulfil its strategic and statutory responsibilities to provide sufficient places for all pupils in Lincolnshire. So since writing the report, the proposed budget for 24-25 will change based on the information that's been discussing, and it will now be 1.438 million. Table 5 on page 25 relates to the Central School Services ongoing commitments. And again, these can be set at any amount, and there are several budgets in here that require approval. First, with admissions, which is our statutory duty to operate the admissions and arrangements in the county schools. We have SACRA, which is expenditure in connection with the local authority's functions in relation to Standing Advisory Council on Religious Education. We then have our LA retained duties for all schools, and this relates to statutory responsibilities for the local authority holds for all schools. Then over to page 26, we have the Service of the Schools Forum. And then finally, we have the centrally employed teachers employee pension contributions. Here we included funding in this block for the increase in employee contribution rates a couple of years ago, and that's to finance those costs. And then finally, table 6 relates on Central School Services block historical commitments, and this budget cannot be set at a higher level than it has in previous years. And this is to fund our PFI contractual commitments. There may be some minor refinements required, as in previous years. Final budgets will be reported at the June meeting. In terms of the education service grant, the local authority continues to make decisions to obtain funding in schools block for statutory duties related to maintain schools only, so there's no financial cost to schools for that. In terms of the financial outlook of the council, although the council projects a deficit in all years, due to the foundations we have set, we are better placed than most to navigate the challenges that lie ahead. And the greatest area of financial risk to children's services is children in care, as detailed on page 28. So in terms of our next steps, then we provide an update today in terms of affordability. Final checks on the APT are undertaken as we speak, and the APT is due for submission on Monday. Budget share will be published on 29th of February. So in terms of conclusion, local authority intends to replicate the formula, subject to steps to address affordability. We're also requesting the forum to approve the continuation of the primary rent factor and to approve a number of central budgets.
Thank you for walking us through what's quite a substantial report. That was much appreciated. Colleagues, there's a number of related but discrete areas, so I'm going to suggest we maybe take questions and discuss them sequentially. So first of all, I think it's worth us pausing and reflecting on the first time the high needs block is forecast to be in a deficit in Lincolnshire. That broader send and high need continuum. Does anyone have any comments or questions in relation to that part of the paper? It's been trialled for some time that this point may come. I think we've been fortunate. I'm using the word fortunate advisedly. There's been a number of things that colleagues have done, both officers and schools, in the wider system, to try and stem that tide. But the austerity is upon us, and demand is only rising. So I think it's important for us as a forum to really dwell on that forecast deficit, because we will be the ones required to make decisions on how that cake is cut up. Please.
Can I just ask the question regarding benchmarking? Has that been undertaken?
Yeah, so there is benchmarking that takes place. We do review that, albeit it is very high level, unfortunately. Therefore, what we tend to do is try and have those details underpinned. So funding formulas underpinned by details, so 0K costed sort of thing. So then we're able to substantiate the reasonableness of costs. We do benchmark ourselves, which is the paper that Sheridan will be taking us through in terms of benchmarking, in terms of data as well, in terms of how we compare on that front. But yes, benchmarking is part of that, as well as engaging with other local authorities in terms of what solutions or what ideas they have in terms of how they're able to mitigate some of those financial challenges. Clearly, we're on an upward curve. And this year we're just about managing that dedicated schools grant position. Next year is going to be something we'll be drawing on reserves. However, as an officer group, of which we'll be having interactions with schools on, is that we've got ideas of how we can look to try and manage this difficult situation. But we are on a bit of an upward curve, although we have booked the trend due to transformation work. And we are not in a deficit position at this moment in time, and we've got reserves to help us, although it's one-off and may not last too long, but it gives us some space, thinking space and time to consider our next steps and then obviously to implement that. So in summary, better position than most local authorities based on the scale of the deficits, but obviously we're seeing the pressures here and now, and we've got some decisions to make in terms of how we can manage this, and clearly we need to set a sustainable budget, and that's our utmost priority, whilst also trying to manage and provide support to schools with children with needs. Are there any other questions or comments in relation to this section, please?
So there's a significant amount of building work to move places within Lincolnshire as opposed to exporting. How will that affect the actual budget itself?
Well, we've pretty much completed the programme. So we've got a number of preschools, I think, to complete now to finish off. So actually, we're already utilising those places. So I think when we were doing the planning work in terms of place numbers and increasing it by 500 places, during that period, we felt that was sufficient. Actually, what we've seen here is quite significant demands beyond that. So it's a reflection for us. So yes, in terms of the modelling, it builds in those places, but actually there are limited numbers left following that 100 million investment. So now it's turning our attention to actually what's this next phase of work. So we can't stop there. Okay, what does it mean in terms of going forward? Is it more special schools, or is it another alternative, whether that's working with mainstream colleagues or the offers that we provide? So that's where I'm sort of talking about the potential options that we've got. We need to work through them to see what's best fit for Lincolnshire and how we can sort of manage needs within Lincolnshire, because essentially that's where the challenges lie, is that when we're using external provision, it comes at a significant cost, both in children in care, but also within the SEND gender as well. And it's how we can mitigate that by keeping children within Lincolnshire, within mainstream schools and within our special school sector, because those unfavourable costs are just making a huge impact financially on our budget. So it's really what that next phase is really critical, and clearly we need to act quickly in terms of that.
So my follow-up to that then is clearly a 50% over budget building programme that has not delivered enough places now. Post-pandemic, I appreciate that that's an effectively. So later in the paperwork, there's the pressure of social and emotional health places going from AP because we're in AP rather than into some of the NCO. Is there a piece being built around what the next provision is going to look like?
Yeah, there are. So, no, you're fine. So what you're pulling up there, Simon, is absolutely right. That there is a significant piece of work that's ongoing, and now is on the brink of going into phase 2 around what's the next plan. If you recall, the Building Specialist Communities of Provision project was designed 5 years ago. So prior to the pandemic, prior to all of those complicating factors, and originally that special schools programme was 56 million. So we've managed to achieve that, which is a real success. And it's not just about the new places, it's also around our special school environments being far better and improved to meet all complex needs. So reducing travel time, etc. I think where we're at next is identifying the geographies within the county and what the needs are within those localities to determine what sort of provision is put in place there. We feel that we do need to design and work in partnership with schools and settings to create those options, because they should be more affordable, they should be of a good quality, and support us within that. But what I would say is post-pandemic, and certainly up until this year, the demand, we were still bucking the trend nationally. So the number of new EHCPs, etc., we were below the national. And that's something that the transformation programme and the partnership should really celebrate. And, you know, it's a success. However, the demand more recently has kind of bloomed. And you'll hear that in Kate's report around AP, but also Sheridan's report around SEND. And it's a three-pronged issue, really. Demand, system level demand, accessing good quality placements, but then affordable placements as well. So that's where the SEMH provisions, etc., are the key thing for us, because we know that if we can create that provision in a more structured way, that will give us significant savings, multi-million-pound savings from the high needs block. I suppose just to elaborate before I hand over to colleagues as well, is this the trajectory of the spend does have implications for Schools Forum, because it's Schools Forum's view and consultation powers to decide on how we manage that. And we are one of the few remaining local authorities who don't do a block transfer. So one of the strategies to manage the high needs block is to do a transfer from the schools block, so 0.5% from the schools block or higher, to make it balance. And I would be really interested as a partnership and as a forum to hear the appetite of that, because essentially if the budget doesn't come under control, as it were, one of the responses is for schools funding to pay for that. I think that's something that as a forum needs to be considered and aired, not to decide upon right now, but that decision is on the horizon. I would suggest. That was a long answer, sorry Simon, to your question, but I just wanted to build in the functionality of the Schools Forum in having that collective responsibility of giving a view on managing this.
Thank you for that. Anything off the back of Martin's response there, or any other questions before we move on? So we can take it as read that we will be discussing this in great detail soon from Heinz block side. Is there anything anyone would like to discuss around the request for the continuation of primary school rents factor? So there's a application request inbuilt here. Affordability gap, which is proposed to be bridged through use of the growth fund in particular. Anything on this point? No. And
sorry, I was just going to say,
yeah.
I think on that number one, the remaining budget is 1.438, isn't it? Is that right? I think it's just a typo on line 3 there, because it says the remaining budget 1.236, but that's reduction, isn't it?
The
Reduction's 1.236 million, leaving 1.438.
that's correct.
Yeah,
So,
right.
It's just really my question is about the impact of that.
so there is no impact from that. So this is something that we've used the school growth fund to manage the affordability over a number of years. So the approach in terms of how the DFE funds is different to how we actually allocate monies. So it's very much at a high level, looking at super output areas that the department use, and essentially look at from one period to the next in terms of that growth in terms of pupils. But that doesn't necessarily translate into a planned reorganisation, such as whether it's a permanent.
So it's not right. Okay.
So essentially, we have, I guess, we win out to that approach. But essentially, in terms of how we work, in terms of our growth funding, we put policies in place. We work with schools, the individuals heads around the table here, where we've got a sufficiency need for places, and then we we then work with you in terms of increasing pounds, and that's where the policies then come in place. So what we've done is we've considered what current arrangements are in place, but also potentially what's potentially going to happen in September, and then we have then used our policies and the national funding formula values to determine what that value is, and that value is that 1.4 million.
Right.
So essentially, it's the remainder is then being released to fund the overall national funding.
Okay. So you're showing us that this basically low risk.
It's very low risk
impact on that.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. And we work with our provision planning colleagues. So where we potentially think there potentially could be something that's coming in September, again, we prudently put something aside to manage that as well. So all current ones and predicted, but also potentially those that may.
You have got a bit of capacity even in that number.
Yes.
So that will come back to with you later.
Yep, so that's right. So essentially what will happen, depending on what position is on that fund, generally it's sort of broadly in line with budgets it tends to be. And then that will just form part of it. If it did remain uncommitted, it'll just form part of the overall dedicated schools grant underspend. And then that will just be carried forward as normal for sort of consideration. Schools forum in the October meeting.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, yeah, please, Sam.
One thing I found difficult when I was reading the early years finance document, and then the language that we use in terms of the different blocks under Schedule 2, the language is slightly different. And I didn't know whether just highlighting what it meant more clearly would help me when I was reading the two documents, or what you can spend money on, what you can't.
Do you want us to
No,
elaborate?
I was just making it was harder to follow the two documents simultaneously.
Understood.
Thank you. There's nothing else on that section of the paper. Then we have a series of tables towards the front of the document around budgets, approval required. So these are the centrally held budgets, various items, some of which can change, some of which can't be any greater than they've been historically. Does anyone have any questions on any of those items, table 4 onwards? Okay. Thank you all for those questions and responses from officers then. So we have 4 recommendations. Firstly, to note the contents of the report. Then the recommendation to support the council's proposal to continue to adopt the national funding formula, including the steps to address that affordability gap described. To agree to the disapplication request for the continuation of primary school rent factor. Finally, to agree that the specific proposals relate to the number of centrally held budgets. So I'd like to propose that we agree to those recommendations. Do I have anyone who will second that? Thank you very much. So for a vote then, colleagues, please. So all those in favour? Thank you. Do we have anyone against? Or any abstentions? No, fabulous. Thank you then. So that's universally carried. Moving on to item number 5 then. So this is the early years national funding formula. I think Geraldine, are you going to talk us through this? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, so the early years report provides a summary of the national funding formula and also provides you with an update on the childcare reforms that are being rolled out this year. We've provided detail on the funding distributions for providers in Lincolnshire for the next financial year, 24-25. And we also wish to seek agreement from School Forum on the proposals relating to the centrally retained budgets. So the government's national funding formula sets out the hourly funding rates that all local authorities receive to deliver the funds entitlements. The spring budget announcements last year provide an additional 288 million for nationally for early years education in 24-25, and also a further 67 million was announced to support in response to the national living wage increases that are going to be happening from April. We received guidance and budget allocations at the end of November from the government, and we've just received, as of last week, an update on the allocation for the funding distribution for the under 2s as well, which is why we've provided an update to the original report. In the spring budget, the government also announced a £4 billion per year expansion of childcare in England. And that's the largest ever expansion of funded childcare that we've had in history. So that includes a number of additional new entitlements and support for wraparound provision for school-age children as well. The intention is that by September 2025, working families with children over the age of 9 months until they start school will be able to access 30 hours of childcare support. And that will be rolled out in phases. So I've provided for you a timeline to show you how that will be introduced in the next couple of years. With regard to the budgets, we've got 7 budget streams now in early years, which also include the 2-year-old entitlement funding for working families and also the new entitlement for children from the term after they reach 9 months. We have an established funding formula in Lincolnshire, so we continue to use that and applied that to the new entitlements as well to determine the funding levels for providers in Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire is still one of the lowest funded counties in the country, largely due to the area cost adjustment that's used within the national funding formula. We have provided the total funding levels for each of the entitlements within the report, so they are detailed for you in terms of the total funding allocations. As always, funding is indicative. Final funding allocations are always based on the census collections, which happen in January. For the new entitlements, the DfE have confirmed that the take-up numbers for working parents and final funding allocations will be adjusted based on actual take-up levels, and they're introducing 2 additional headcounts so that we can provide information to them in addition to the January census. The key requirements have been outlined for you within the report, and as always, compliance is monitored through our Section 251 returns to the department. The report explains the theoretical model that we have used in Lincolnshire to determine the local rates for childcare providers. And we've then explained the rates for 3 and 4-year-olds, 2-year-olds and children under 2 from working households. There are 3 tables within the report that detail the budget breakdown. That includes the base rate funding for providers and then the additional supplementary elements of the funding. So we are going to continue to apply a deprivation supplement for the 3 and 4-year-old entitlement. And we've also introduced a deprivation factor within the 2-year-old entitlement, and that will be based on those children that are eligible due to the disadvantage criteria attached to that entitlement. And we intend to also build in inclusion funding into the funding model, and that will be applied to the 3 and 4-year-olds, the 2-year-olds and the under 2s, and a fixed rate will be applied for all funding streams related to that. In relation to those 3 areas, the 3 and 4-year-olds, 2-year-olds and under 2s, we obviously have central costs that determine what support we give to the childcare sector. As a local authority, we have a number of statutory duties that we need to fulfil. And we've provided a summary of the 3 areas that we support within the local authority to early years and childcare providers. The total central costs as a portion of the overall funding represents 3.12%. And the areas of support that we provide to the sector are related to the delivery of the early years entitlement funding and managing the payments to providers, and also our statutory duties relating to securing sufficiency of places. And then also in relation to quality support, advice and workforce and training for the sector, and then also support related to special educational needs in the local office. After the central costs, and we've also given information there on the maintained nursery school supplementary funding stream. As always, the government are applying that to local authorities based on universal hours only. And in Lincolnshire, we know that the costs are associated with delivering universal and extended hours. So we apportion the funding that we receive from the government across all of those hours to determine a rate for the maintained nursery schools. We've also then detailed an increase that we are going to be receiving for disability access funding and early years pupil premium funding, and that will be rolled out in its entirety as those funding streams are separate from the main early years DSG. We did complete consultation with the childcare sector in October last year, following the national funding formula consultation that the government carried out. And within that, we've detailed some of the feedback that we had from the sector, and that's provided for you in the report. And just as a summary, really, we are continuing our discussions with the department to ensure that Lincolnshire does receive a fair funding rate. We are also talking to them about the way that they distribute funding to local authorities and basing funding on census periods and how that affects the budgets and how we can roll that out to the sector. So thank you. Schools Forum is asked to note the contents of the report and also to agree the proposals that we've made for centrally retained funding.
Thank you very much. It's really helpful. So some welcome news at a national level in terms of what has been, to some extent, the forgotten part of the sector.
Yes.
As subsequent funding increases have come through, albeit with a local level of risk still, because of the way that Lincolnshire is funded more broadly. Really comprehensive report. We have a decision to make. Does anyone have any questions?
Not really a question, it's more thanks to Geraldine and her team. They really do support our sector. However, much as I appreciate all this new funding that's coming out, there are a lot of PVI settings that are not going to be here next year because the 9.8% increase in wages, the rates that the heating, fuel, everything else has gone out, the change in formula for your business rates that changed in September, that sent some nurseries spiralling into debt. No way can they pay the rates that they're being asked for. It's just not sustainable. And the fact that we're finding it very hard to recruit. Who wants to go and earn just over minimum wage in a nursery when they can earn more than that at Tesco stacking shelves? It's and they're expected to be qualified paediatric first aid, behaviour management, baby qualifications. It's just I think they're going to soon find that their new flagship childcare is not going to work in some areas. So, but thank you very much for trying, Geraldine.
Could I just echo that? So I'm a director of a childcare centre, so that's an interest you want to declare there or not. But yeah, significant challenges to the sector. In Stamford, you've seen nurseries going out to business. So I think what I'd also echo is that some of the language in this has been taken from the government political proposal, and it's very laudable, but actually it feels very different on the ground when you've got nurseries, as I say, who've been long established, but frankly, they're renting a space. The rents have gone up, the costs have gone up for food, energy, and staff, and they're the major costs to business. So when this comes in, and what's happening is effectively the funding coming in from government is less than funded places that we paid for privately. It impacts on the viability of that business. And it also implies that people have got a choice over the, whether it's 20 hours, 30 hours, and when I can do it, which days, etc. And that choice simply isn't there. So I think it's a great aim and some great work being done on it, but I think as it hits the ground, we're going to see significant challenges that need to be overcome by people.
Just in response to that, I think, yeah, absolutely. We recognise the challenges that the early years sector are facing. I think it's welcome news that the government are investing additional money, but appreciate that that's still not meeting all provider costs. And we are trying to do as much as we can in terms of business forums and support to the sector directly, bespoke support and training that we're providing to look at different business models and look at funding forecasts and try and provide support to the sector, because we've got such a range of providers in Lincolnshire, some very astute private businesses and some childminders and preschools that are operating out of village halls, and then some school provision. So a real variety and very different governance models can have very different cost implications. So we are trying to support the sector as much as we can to maintain a sustainable provision. There's some things that are happening nationally which are welcome as well, and hopefully will support with recruitment and retention, because we completely understand that that is a pressure not just in Lincolnshire but across the country. And yes, I think all we can try to do is lobby government as much as possible to try and support the costs and make sure that we can do everything possible to maximise the amount of funding that we can push out to providers, but we do appreciate pressures that the sector's facing.
And those things you're talking about, are they coming from the centrally retained funding? Is that what you're looking to do?
Yeah.
That's
It's part of what we deliver as a service, and those business forums and things that are rolled out as part of the training package that we offer. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts or questions? I just have one. Given what's been discussed and described there, has any modelling been done around sufficiency, whether we might begin to assist provision?
Yeah, absolutely. We did deliver an update on the childcare sufficiency recently, and we do an annual assessment of childcare sufficiency and look at the number of places that are being offered, those that are already filled, and those that then are spare capacity. We know that there are some areas across Lincolnshire that we've got a deficit of places, and we need to support the development of new places. Thankfully, as part of the reforms, the government have added additional funding to local authority budgets to look at expanding places. Capital funding has been linked to that as well. So again, we're looking at rolling that out this year and making sure that we can build places where there's a lack of places that will be needed for those working families as well.
Thank you. If there's nothing else on this paper, then question. We are asked to approve the central retained budgets that are proposed here. I'm going to propose that. Would anyone like to second it? Thank you, Julian. So we need to put our hands up on that again. All those in favour, please. Any against? Or abstentions? So again, it's been carried. Thank you so much. Again, something we're going to keep a really close eye on as a follow. So next for us then, into Kate to talk us through the alternative provisions.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm presenting today. It's a summary of the alternative provision arrangements in Lincolnshire for 2022-23. The report sets out at the start the background around our commissioning arrangements at that period of time, which is around Springwell and Build a Future, which support around behaviour, and the Pilgrim School, which support around medical. The report then moves into the commission numbers in relation to those, setting out we have 252 primary and secondary cases at Springwell, and then moves into the arrangements that are in place with Build a Future, and the contract to Build a Future came to an end at the end of 22-23. The contract finished, and the local authority is in the progressing with plans to block commission a similar level of places through new arrangements. It then sets out the 8 places that we commission at Pilgrim in relation to medical. The report then moves on to elements of data. The first part of the report sets out the national data, which, as we're aware, there is that lag of data around the national picture. So the data around the national picture is from 2021-22. What that data shows for that period of time is a similar kind of picture to previous years, with our permanent exclusions in line with the England rate and our suspensions slightly higher. It also sets out a comparison with the East Midlands. The report then moves into where we're able to look at our local data, which means we're able to look at the last year, the 2022-23, and what that's showing us, and from conversations with school leaders, is that significant increase in exclusions being issued in Lincolnshire. As a result of this, and to enable local authority to deliver its duty around providing education 6 days after a permanent exclusion, as a result of that, our intervention places in key stage 3 and 4, there was very little ability to offer those short-term placements from the end of the autumn term of 22. The report then details the pressure on the budget in relation to this. We've already heard the report earlier about high needs block, and obviously the funding for alternative provision also comes out of that block of funding. Sets out the financial impact. The report then moves into the local data around suspensions, and again we've seen a significant increase in the table on 37 shows that. page 37. The report then goes into the overarching reasons around the exclusions, and the highest reasons regarding exclusions and suspensions is around that persistent disruptive behaviour, both of which saw an increase during that time period. The report then moves into what support is in place. Obviously, the Lincolnshire behavioural ladder of intervention is the main kind of overarching element of that support, and within that, the pupil reintegration, their support is detailed, and then the report moves into the work of the behaviour outreach support team, or what we know as BOSS. You can then see from the report the impact of BOSS, and it sets out that although intervention places around key stage 3 and 4 were part of last year, it does show the positive impact around those which have continued for primary and for that limited period around the secondary, and also the impact of BOSS in relation to avoiding permanent exclusions. As we go into page 40, the end of page 40, and going into page 41 of the report then looks at the adjustments to support that was already in place, and also details some of the support that remains and is continuing to be built on. This involves some tweaks to the ladder, particularly around that crucial early intervention element, and then details around the collaborative head teacher intervention panels, what's affectionately known as CHIPS, and also around the inclusion conference that was held last year in direct response to requests for support from settings. The local authority is also continuing to look at the availability of alternative provision, and we're increasing that link to the elements in the report. But this comes at considerable cost to the high needs budget, which, as we've already heard, is under that huge and unsustainable pressure. There's also added into the mix a scarcity of availability of alternative provision within the marketplace. The report then on the bottom of page 41 just highlights the need for that crucial shift for all of us looking at this and how we're going to adjust the way that we work as a local area. And it's really positive that we're having numbers of conversations and ongoing working with settings and a number of schools that are already making those steps and making those shifts, which is really positive. We'll continue to build on. Page 42 then moves into the other element of alternative provision, which is around the medical needs. Emotional-based school avoidance pathway, the EBSA, was launched in September 2021, and that was set up primarily to support what was felt was going to be an impact from COVID and lockdowns. As set out in Lincolnshire's SEMH strategy, and you'll all be aware from that, the review of the pathway was due to take place last academic year. That's happened, and the report details what occurred and who was involved in that. And that as per the aim of the SEMH strategy, there's been a real focus on the updated pathway around the early intervention through that focus on whole school approaches and support. Toolkit's also been added, and crucially as well, it's now a fully electronic version. Previously it was a hard copy of the attend paperwork, but it's now fully electronic and accessed via Lincolnshire's local offer. And it was rolled out to schools for the start of term 2 of this academic year. And then finally, although it's only a small paragraph, crucially as well, the Lincolnshire's alternative provision review continues to be completed and is clearly key going forward with the changing landscape and the pressures within that, and for us ensuring we've got that clear strategic focus going forward. That also links in with the government's plans linked to their Send an Alternative Provision Improvement Plan, and that's running alongside that.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues will be obvious to everyone. I have an interest in this item in particular. So with that, there are no decisions, but just to understand the point, in addition to the name card, inclusion for us as a forum representing the whole sector is something close to each of us, similar to the SEND profile. Though after a big transformational change 5 or 6 years ago, we are now facing a new reality, which is very expensive in both kind of financial terms and cost for individuals and communities. So really important stuff. Does anyone have any questions? Please, sir.
Can I ask a question? Table in the middle of page 37, number of suspensions per academic year. So those numbers could change dramatically on the answer. Are they per person or are they per day?
Sorry, this suspension, sorry, not the
Not the exclusion.
the suspensions are per day, so they're not per pupil. We have got that data, but it's.
And then my follow-up to that, in terms of kind of the cumulative frequency element of it, is are you seeing more pupils being suspended for the same amount of time, or more pupils being suspended for more time?
I think it's probably a mixture of both. So there's elements of linked to the persistent disruptive behaviour. We're seeing pupils suspended more often as part of persistent disruptive behaviour, but we're also seeing more pupils being suspended.
In terms of the sorry, if I may, colleagues, in terms of the shift that you describe and the matters that are resulting in some of these numbers, it might be interesting to kind of explode that a little bit so we can see frequency by individual total, just to get a sense of how this is impacting the young people and the settings.
Absolutely, yeah, and include that going forward.
Interesting, yeah, because there's the data and then there's the reality. Sorry, go on, Sam, jump back in and then we'll go around.
And it just follows up on that, because obviously there's the 5-day, done suspensions per exclusions. There's the 5-day element, the 15-day element, and the 45-day element. And as heads, we'll often wager according to the impact it will have on our budget when it hits 6 days, etc. That we play through. So that might be part of that, kind of thinking about the frequency and on how long we're choosing to suspend for.
Yeah, no, I can certainly expand the information for the next report.
Please, absolutely.
Hi, I was just asking a question. Is that just Lincolnshire students or students from other authorities? Because we've got schools with lots of Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Peterborough kids.
Absolutely. So the numbers are for Lincolnshire schools. The numbers in the table on page 37 are ones that then weren't overturned or withdrawn or rescinded. The actual number of permanent exclusions issued for children and young people in Lincolnshire was 250. So we have got exclusions that are from out of county, as sort of we're at schools out of county, but they're not included in this information. This is the Lincolnshire school.
I've got another point that is related to it. Really, it's to we've got 2 secondary schools down in the south of the county of South Holland, and between them, they've currently got 32 looked after children, and 8 of them in one school are from Cambridgeshire. So I've raised this before, and that does have an impact on the climate in the school, because most of those children come with checkered histories and some chaotic backgrounds, need a great deal of support, and they can influence the behaviours that schools are facing. And I think that's a consideration that could well be looked at.
Absolutely.
Please, sir.
I met with 4 other heads this morning in far more challenging schools than I'm in, and that was the most common thing coming across, was the fair access protocol was moving, in some cases, 30 odd students who were very challenging into a large secondary, resulting in much more challenging behaviour from other students. And although I appreciate the fair access protocol and its intention, one of the knock-on effects has been significant disruption, which is potentially going to raise that number even further.
Yeah, it's a real challenging situation, isn't it? And you know, this report isn't downplaying the challenges within schools at the moment. And certainly that's something from talking to school leaders that we're hearing across the board. It's that mid-year movement, and often for children that aren't moving house, if you like, they're children that are moving schools through a choice of wanting to move schools rather than needing to because they've moved house, if you like. But yeah, there is the challenges around that. Absolutely.
Steve, please.
Just to add to the mid-year admissions question and fair access protocol, one of the schools that we work with, last year there were 53 mid-year admissions. This year so far there've been 47. So it's 100 today, in a school that's got 700 youngsters in it over 2 years, well, less than 2 years. And that's a huge impact on a school. And just another thing that's key to note as well, when youngsters are moved, it tends to be near the end of year 7, during year 8 and year 9, but 14 and 12 youngsters have been moved in key stage 4, where there's very little time for the receiving school to affect the changes. And there's 2 things around that. We need to consider how we can perhaps reduce those movements and make sure that those movements aren't concentrated in small numbers of schools, because I think that's unfair. And also, when we analyse the performance of schools on a global level, we should be taking more consideration the fact that schools that are inclusive and, you know, do accept these youngsters, there should be some benefit awarded for that in turn, because they are taking on some very severe issues. So if you add those one school, if you add the 100 mid-year admissions so far and the 11 black youngsters out of 700 kids, that's a big ask.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to, excuse me, pick on some of those points, because obviously it does paint a picture of increasing pressure and challenge within schools, and I don't think anybody's underplaying that or denying that that's happening. What I would just draw out particularly is that on the high needs block, these small numbers for the population have real significant impact on the high needs block because of that placement challenge and placement demand. I also just want to take the opportunity, because it doesn't necessarily bring it out in the paper, but to celebrate the work of the vast majority of schools. So, you know, over 300, I think it was, schools out of Lincolnshire hadn't gone to a PX. And I think that's not to say that they haven't had the challenges or children who are presenting difficult behaviours, but I think it's just worth noting and celebrating that they've been able to find a way to adapt and meet some of those needs within schools. I think the side knock-on effect of some of those things are some of this movement post-pandemic. So just for the Schools Forum awareness, you know, mid-year admissions are higher than they ever have been in the past, with no real rationale between school movements other than school dissatisfaction, whatever school dissatisfaction can be interpreted or meaning, and can cover a whole host of different reasons. So we do keep looking at that very carefully, and we do keep raising this with the points that you make, Steve, really around the DFE, around how you manage that process, who is responsible for administering and policing it to make sure that movements are required, appropriate, etc. And we will continue to do that because we see that as a challenge for the local authority, but also a challenge for the system. And we'll also try and figure out ways of continuing to communicate with our out of region colleagues, so those colleagues in those other areas. But I will say, having visited the secondary school this morning and seeing the needs that are presented, that I do think schools are working really hard to put their mind to different ways of being as inclusive as possible. Notwithstanding that, the PX numbers and the AP market is an equal risk to the high needs block as special educational needs demand is as well. And so it's one of those ones where we all, as a system and as a sector, just need to keep putting our minds to it. And I would always say, if there are any new ideas or suggestions of what can be done, the local authority is always open to those ideas as well. But thank you for those comments, and we'll take some of those outside of this meeting and reflect on them as well.
Just got one question. Build the Future, has that contract been renewed? I didn't quite pick that up from when I was still in negotiation.
No, the contract's ended. It reached its end point, and so we've developed an alternative plan to replace that capacity through a different partner who is in a position to be able to support us with that. There is a delay on being able to do that because we've got to do building works, but it should be up and running this calendar year.
Andrew, would you still like to comment?
Yes, I want to echo what Steve has said earlier with those comments. I am a chair of one of those schools, so I do see it on a regular basis. I sit on the discipline panels. I see those children going through the process of either going through the fixed term exclusions or their permanent exclusions. Some lessons I pick up from that is particularly getting the support that those families need can be a challenge. And there's usually all the protocols in place, but you can't move on to the next stage until that protocol has been passed. So there is definitely the ladder in place, but very often they don't fulfill one part of that. So they go back to the beginning. And by the time you've got through a year, you're losing the child. So from a governor's perspective, the school, while it's trying to be extremely inclusive, is very disappointed. One of the things we are trying to do as governors is actually get involved a little bit earlier than under the statutory processes of 15 days. If we're seeing these suspensions going up, we're getting in a little bit earlier to just try and have a word with the parents in a formal meeting with the school. But again, I can tell from the number of children that are in that particular school that I cannot believe senior leaders can carry on with the amount of work they're having to put in. Some children are not staying in school to either. I've seen a year 8 assessment report where teachers could not even tell you what this child was capable of achieving because they've been absent so much, either through exclusions or through absence. And that has continued over the past term. The parent is very ill, split family again, but it's not happening. So they're falling through the cracks. And I raise that as a serious issue, that we're under funding pressure, but communities are being let down because we know it's certain communities that are particularly affected by this. So I speak as someone who goes into school on a non-professional basis and sees this firsthand.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Please.
one of the things picked up, I think, on page 40, looking at the two graphs. Interesting, actually. About 30, I'm right to say about 30% of the permanent, the 16-week suspensions, alternative provision ended up with those students going into a specialist setting rather than returning into mainstream or staying where they were.
I think I've interpreted your question correctly. But
Sorry.
no. So no. So the paragraph on there hopefully explains that when looking at those, so 86% of pupils that access an intervention placement had not been permanently excluded a year later. However, when you then add in the proportion that transferred to a specialist setting, it then drops to 57%.
So about 30% end up in a specialist setting.
Yes, it doesn't mean they've been permanently excluded. Yeah, it means that they've moved to a specialist setting.
I would come back to that earlier comment about a piece around what we do with those students, because obviously they were actually in mainstream settings and have ended up in specialist settings with another school in between, and the speed of that transfer has obviously affected an awful lot of other students in that process, so they're equally entitled to high level of education.
Absolutely, and I think that probably links with Sheraton's paper that she's going to present in a moment, and around that overlap with special educational needs. Absolutely, and the earlier comments as well around special school places, etc.
Joe, sorry.
I just wanted to kind of echo what Andrew said actually about the whole, we've often kind of from an education setting look at the impact on our schools in terms of having disrupted pupils and the exclusion rates and everything like that. But I think it's a really interesting point because it's the families too. So especially we talked about the looked after children sector, and it is that family support. We used to have family liaison officers. We used to have a lot more kind of a family support. We don't have that anymore. Totally understand the financial impact of that. But I do think it is perhaps an area that would be of interest to look at to see if we can bring that, because if we have the family support with some of these difficult families that we have in schools, we will see less movement and less exclusions. So whilst it's a diversion of funding, it might actually have that positive impact that we need to see within the whole communities rather than just within individual schools and on individual pupils. Like,
More holistic.
it's the whole holistic approach to it, rather than just looking at one sort of pinpoint. I do think it's a very important approach that could be, you're asking for different ideas. I think it's perhaps an approach that needs to be looked at how we can incorporate those families. And I think kind of, yeah, I sit as a governor in different places, and it is the thing when you sit on exclusion panels and you sit on disciplinary panels, there is a trend as to the families that are sat in front of you. And quite often they're the families that don't really understand what they're sitting and listening to, and they need the support. And I think that's something that we perhaps don't have anymore.
Yeah, I think we do. If I'm all right to come back, Chair, on that. So I think in Lincolnshire, and it's different across the county, I'm not saying it's perfect, but in Lincolnshire, we've had a long established early help model that isn't something that appears in every local authority. So we've got early help, and then you go on to the child in need, etc. But also just for schools forum to connect some of these strategies up. That I think the government's probably beginning to recognise some of these challenges with the introduction of things like family hubs. Although family hubs at the moment feels more early years as an agenda, its ambition is 0 to 25 and to be a hub of that. And I think that's recognising some of that, Joe. I'm not saying it'll address it, but it recognises some of that. And also just to acknowledge the kind of recent announcement around Pathfinder for Lincolnshire. So Lincolnshire is one of 3 local authorities that's been identified as a Pathfinder authority with some additional funding to take the best of our current system, but also look at how you can enhance and adapt and add things to it to make it even better. And so that's online. I'm not saying it's perfect right now, but I think there are national recognitions of that and funding coming in to deliver it. And that's very worthwhile and worthy and great. I suppose in the schools forum though, we're dealing with the challenge now here in terms of those pressures and those demands. There's also something around, you would have seen in different medias. I think we are living through a phase where the social contract between schools and education is almost under review from communities and parents, and there's something around us working very hard as a system to re-establish that and that's the value of that education, because certainly the children who are the most vulnerable, whether that's with challenging behaviour, what we know and what we can see is if the right solutions and support can be put in place over that period of time, the outcomes are better for that young person, whatever that outcome might be. The challenge, of course, is high needs block overspends. What has to be delivered is the statutory function. And as head teachers know from my conversations at leadership briefings, it's the early intervention part that then stifled. It's a vicious circle. And actually, if we can get the demand and placement costs down to create capacity in that high needs budget, the conversation's then very different around what are we seeing, what do we need to design in the system to be able to support that. And so it's an interconnected tension and challenge. And so we'd love to do all of the intervention work and aspiration, but whilst the statutory spend's going on and overspending, that constrains us as a body of people to doing what we know makes the biggest difference.
Can I just come back with one point on that, really? Because absolutely, there's lots of things in place. I think what we often see in schools is that it's getting those parents to access the early help. So it's that it's the crossover between the narrative between schools and parents at that point. I work with a lot of children within the looked after system, and it's the intimidation. It's that understanding, and it can come across that they feel intimidated, so therefore they don't access. So I think things are there and things are good. I wonder whether it's the narrative around those things that perhaps isn't a monetary thing, it's just an approach thing.
I think there's a key issue with attendance as well. We've all heard nationally. I was looking at data today. I think the East Midlands average is 91.7 in the secondary sector. And that's significantly down pre-pandemic. And you can't get good outcomes with youngsters if they're not in school. And we've had to increase the number of education officers in our schools threefold. Yet I've had no additional funding to try and accommodate that. It's very, very difficult, and that drives a lack of engagement as well. And it's actually very difficult to get some families into school to talk about the fact that their child isn't in school. Very hard.
Coming back to the social contract. Andrew, I was going to invite you in anyway. Thanks.
I was just going to say, Joe, thank you for coming in with your view on that as well, because I think what I'm seeing is parents not accessing that help very early on. And it's the last permanent exclusion we did was for a child with ADHD, actually, but the parent refused to actually seek that. Although she said all of her friends had done, he was the last one out of the small group to actually do it, because she tried to find other routes and it just didn't work. And actually that positive reinforcement that her friends were giving him wasn't there. I don't think the early support was in that family to get them there. And actually, since that permanent exclusion happened, he's now getting medication, he's now getting the right support, and she's dropped the independent review panel. But that was going to add further effort onto Lincolnshire County Council's officers to deal with that. So it's a small step. I don't think it's money. I think there's just something lacking, joining that message and helping them early on, after year 7, perhaps.
I think, yeah, I would agree. I think it's more about narrative than it is about money. Yeah.
I think it's both.
I think that accessing early help, absolutely, in terms of absenteeism and stuff, and that there's a monetary attachment with that. But I think in terms of parental engagement, I think is narrative rather than money.
It's really interesting, reflected on a report on alternative provision arrangements, that the substance of the conversation is all focused on upstream of the AP, which is in response to kind of that point of crisis or breakdown. Everything we've talked about is before the actual provision, which I think is perhaps what's touched on in terms of the review and what next.
It's got the next paper about special needs has got access and broken down by gender, and it isn't in this part, and that might be quite useful. I suspect it's heavily male, but it would be nice to know that information if it was available.
Are there any other thoughts or comments? Please.
Are there also not hidden costs in terms of the impact that the challenging behaviour by students has on staff, both in terms of retention, recruitment, and generally the perception of the profession? I mean, clearly that around the table there are a number of governors, there are a number of head teachers. I wonder how they perceive the situation.
I'd just like to support that, Andrew. It's 2 cases that I've had in one of my schools that I'm a governor at is where the TAs have actually been attacked, and it then becomes a workload upon the school to well-being. Well-being becomes a major focus of that, and it's very interesting DFE report about exclusions by, I can't remember his name, by one of the doctors who was advising the DFE about permanent exclusion, and we shouldn't hide it away, but it's there as a tool, because there is the knock-on effects of what is happening to the staff and the other pupil group that you have when you've got a disruptive child in there. And I appreciate, Martin, the feedback that everybody goes about keeping the child in the setting for as long as you possibly can and trying as many different things as you can. I fully support Joe with the engagement with the parents has been probably the hardest issue out of the lot. Is in those 2 cases, parents just didn't want to know. There's no turn up at the disciplinary panel. It was just left. That's it. They'll allow the system to deal with it, even with trying to engage with them. But that's the reality of what the people are dealing with, and the physical attacks on even in primary schools, a year 5 or a year 6 pupil. Some of these young lads are quite well built, and we're having to team teach on a regular basis. It is a well-being issue that as governors we have to be really aware of, and how the school's dealing with it.
I would back that up too. Just in one of my schools, we've lost 2 staff because trying to avoid permanent exclusion, basically. It is a reality. It is an absolute reality.
Yes, I mean, I raise it as I'm here to represent classroom teachers fundamentally. It's an issue that certainly comes up, you know, on the casework that we do as a union.
So it will be interesting to hear thoughts on the review, because presumably, like with the high needs system more generally, just more provision isn't beyond the answer. We've all talked about things ahead of the provision, so
Absolutely. That's what feeds in what we're talking about, is that inclusion as early as possible, and those supportive strategies to try and avoid it escalating to that level.
absolutely make sure professionals in settings feel safe and have the skills and the mechanisms to be able to get support if needed, which all costs money. Anything else on this page?
Sorry. Boss service. Did I read in the report there's intention for that to be earlier?
So it kind of links a little bit to the earlier comments from Andrew as well. So the ladder was tweaked, to the want of a phrase, in that looking at boss becoming involved earlier. So that's happened. Also introduced consultation sessions as well. That was in direct response to school leaders saying about those transfers in school movement, so that rather than having to start from scratch if they haven't got information from the previous school, it can be escalated and supported through an earlier system, if you like. But as always, if there's any other pupils that are struggling and need some support, absolutely the pupil integration team are there to support around that, and if not, support themselves to signpost and get the right people involved as well. Yeah, it already is. That's already been done. That was done last academic year, so it's in place.
Because my view on that, I do sit on the independent review panels. So one of the ones, for instance, I've done recently, can take all the previous points. Dad's in prison, mum was in prison for 3 years. The students in front, and they've permanently excluded because it was easier than they got pre-AP, but haven't got to AP, and it was going to clearly be a quicker, simple system for everybody else left. That permanent exclusion was a faster option before the disruption to everybody else. And the youngest one I've done was a student in year 1, so it's a permanent exclusion. So I think it's very much ongoing and getting bigger.
Colleagues, if we move on, thank you all for that recommendation here. Was just a note and comment. Do need to ask, is everyone satisfied that we've done that? Anyone? Yes, thank you. Conscious we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. So we're in person. Folk can't just turn the camera off and nip out for a comfort break. Does anyone want a quick break, or should we plough on? Plough on. Let's say colleagues can nip out if they need to. Toilets are just there if you don't know. But please don't nip out too long. Thank you. Very good. Don't nip out too soon now, otherwise you might miss Sheridan's. So can I invite you, Sheridan?
Thank you for the opportunity of providing this as a supplementary report, because this is supplementary to the annual report. But as you'll probably remember, the annual report last year report on a fair amount of the data, because it was literally published after I'd submitted the report, or around about the same time, where that enables us to do some direct comparisons with the national picture. You'll see I've made a comment in here that the DfE are still advising caution over interpreting the data. I think we know our data pretty well, but it means that some of the comparisons where I put them in, they might not be exact, because last year was the first year that we submitted pupil level data. So, and I think that's why it took a long time to publish last year as well. This is our second year. Today is actually SES, where everything freezes and we count everything and then it's submitted in March. So the next round of data will be included in the next annual report, which will be in June of this year. And hopefully they'll get it out quicker this time. We'll be able to put it all in one. So what I've attempted to do is also is sort of add in some of the things that I would ordinarily have included last year, but at the same time bring you up to date with a couple of things, just to give you the heads up where we currently stand, the state of the nation in Lincolnshire in relation to special education needs and disability. I don't propose to take every element of this. I'm sure you've had an opportunity to read it, but I guess what I would summarise in terms of the first page with the data on, which is page 47, you'll see that everything's going up. And where we have invested a lot of effort with the support of yourselves and the sector in trying to intervene earlier, in trying to make sure that we've got services available. I think it's fair to say that we still see some of the positives around that. And I think it has certainly kept things at bay a little bit over the last couple of years. But then in this last year, 2023, which will obviously be reported in more detail in June, but you can already see that our increases and our growth is more than it was in the previous year. We don't have an awful lot to compare it to at the moment because the national data is only published once a year, but the DFE are doing quarterly surveys, which is it's an option for local authorities to submit a return. We always submit. There's about 103 local authorities submitting, and when we can see just from that data, although it's limited, everything is still going upwards in terms of the number of children with EHC plans and the number of requests that are coming through. So I won't dwell on that first bit of information that's on page 47, but just to take you to page 48, one of the things that the forum asked for, I think we missed it out a couple of years ago, that local data, that sort of district data, and you asked us to put that back in. So you'll see this time, this is the first year since I started putting this back in, that we've got increases in both SEN support and EHC plans. There isn't a district that's gone down at all. But obviously, just pulling out, I try not to make too many comments about how I interpret this, but obviously you'll see that 7.12% EHC plans in Lincoln, that's a lot. Our national figure is about 4.3 the last time it was published. So we've got more work to do, having a look at just understanding what's going on in Lincoln, because this is all done in proportion to the number of school age pupils we've got on roll. So, but this time we've not seen anybody coming down. It's all gone up. And then in terms of educational placements, I think, again, the forum was really interested in where children are placed. And you'll see, really positive that we've still got 46.4% of our EHC plans are young people in mainstream schools. But then obviously we've got quite a spread. And it's probably important to kind of lump some of these together, because special schools, in terms of the number of children in state-funded special schools, our academies and maintained schools, although that looks as if it's gone down, it's effectively gone down as a proportion because we haven't got any special school places left at the moment. So the numbers in the independent sector are going up, either using independent non-maintained specialist schools, which are very costly, or also the number of independent mainstream schools where we've actually said that children need special school, but those independent mainstream schools are providing that support largely because what's identified are low arousal situations for young people and smaller class sizes. And so although we've said they need special schools, some of those independent mainstreams are providing effectively what that young person needs. And then just moving on in terms of our primary need, we have seen some changes over this last year. So it is the first time, I've been doing this for quite a long time. I've been in the county council for a very long time. And it's the first time that we can recall that moderate learning difficulties is now not number one primary need in secondary schools. It's still top of the league table in primaries, but not in secondary. And I think you may have some comments, and I'm happy to address them. But the reason I've put in the breakdown and the ranking by the national comparison is just to give you a flavour of where we stand in Lincolnshire and where there are some differences. And I think in secondary schools in particular, social, emotional, mental health is the third primary need in our secondary schools in Lincolnshire, but it's actually first nationally. So we do have some differences, which I've put in. I don't do all of it. We have the breakdown under all the different DFE headings that are for the school census, but I've just focused on those sort of top three, as you can see. So if there's any questions at the end about that, I'm happy to address them. Timescales, Lincolnshire generally, we do very well in terms of our 20-week timescale for assessment, but I thought it was really worthwhile pointing out that is going down at the moment. So we're at 83.3%. We know that nationally from the DFE quarterly surveys, we know that most of the country is around 50%, and some of our neighbouring authorities are down to 0%. So Lincolnshire still performs well in terms of the 20-week timescale, but the pressure and the volume of work coming through is we're dipping because we need the people available to do the assessments for us, and at the moment they're queuing up. And it's probably just worth me mentioning, as I always do, that actually we get this increase at the end of every term, the increase in the number of assessments that come in. It creates a bottleneck. So always asking, to try and stack them, bring them in as they're ready, and you need to submit an EHC needs assessment request. It would be great not to have them all coming in at the end of terms. And obviously, as colleagues have talked about earlier, we know we've got pressures on the high needs budget. And although we do quite a lot of analysis of the high needs budget, where we're spending money, we've got lots of different breakdowns in terms of the big headings. We've now got to a point where we need to be more forensically analysing every element of it to see where we might be identifying things that seem unusual or different. This is where benchmarking becomes quite challenging because not everybody is disclosing information in this way. We don't report on it nationally in this way. But I thought it was really, just as a starter for 10, to include the detail about the mainstream top-up. So only children in mainstream and only under 16s. We haven't put the post-16 in. Only under 16s in mainstream settings. That budget, which is already over 30 million, 78% of the budget is spent on supporting children for more than 25 hours a week. So we've got a staggering number of young people that are supported throughout all of their learning time. And for many of them, it's actually throughout the whole day, as I'm sure some of you know very well. And I guess the flip side of that, not wanting to be provocative in any way, but the flip side is, we're still really worried about the high levels of absence of our SEN cohort. Kate's talked about exclusions, suspensions, the rate of progress. So it definitely feels with the system that there's a lot of money going in on having somebody with a young person a lot of the time, but actually how do we start making that difference so that the outcomes for these young people are improving? So again, not trying to be controversial, but just saying we're spending an awful lot of money there. Is there something we can do differently? Because that's it's a lot of money, and it's a collective gathering, I suppose, of minds about, is there something else we could do differently? And appreciating that we have to take parents with us, because actually, parents often feel that what they need is a learning support assistant with their child all the time. So it's how do we instill confidence in parents as well, that actually their young person doesn't have to have an adult with them all the time. There are other options. So, we welcome obviously about how we do something differently. And then the other pressure that we've got is the growing cost of independent, non-maintained specialist provision. And that isn't just about the numbers and the reliance that we've got on it at the moment. It is about the fact that they can charge whatever they want. There is no cap on any of that. So the fees are going up. One of our providers that has been consistently £50,000 a year as of January the 1st has just gone up to 70. So for every child that we place there, that's another 20,000 on top of that. So, it's not just about numbers. It is about the fact there are things beyond our control, but actually we need the places, so we have to.
Is that a result of issues that we've described earlier, or is that profiteering, do you think?
think it's a mixture of both, and it's not a transparent system. One of the things that is being looked at through the national review is to have some more transparency around this. So there are some providers that will give you a really good breakdown and you can see exactly how they've made that up. And then others that it's very difficult to tell. And yes, there are shareholders, you know, people like
Registered in the Cayman Islands.
yes. Well, you know, we know that one provider in the background, it's Roadchef. It's Roadchef that are the main employer. So they're not even an education provider themselves. But so yes, there's got to be profit for sure.
Can I just to interject, Sheridan? Sorry, apologies to interrupt. But it's all we're talking from a Lincolnshire perspective, but this is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy because there's such a national pressure and demand for placements that actually we say it's unrelated. It's almost it's like the highest bidder. So we're very aware as well of some providers in the market who nationally come onto the scene, and almost other local authorities, dependent on their situation, are just bulk buying and will pay whatever they need to pay to fulfil that statutory duty of providing an education, which is admirable, but the financial consequences of that are.
You read about it.
Yes, you've seen it in other local authority areas. So it's a really difficult one, and that's why it's important to link it back to the earlier conversation around how we create those local solutions and ideas, because actually, if it costs £25,000 per placement rather than £80,000, we're spending more, but we're cost avoiding quite a bit, but still giving the better deal to that child. And so you talk to other local authorities, and it is really, really challenging. So we're just seeing the beginning of that pressure. Other local authorities have had that for a couple of years, and so moving it and changing it, the only answer really is in the partnership within the local area to fund new ideas and concepts. Sorry, Sharon.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Martin. So just moving through very quickly on, the other question that we've got is around interim home tuition, which is what we provide when we've got young people that are waiting for special school places and they are at risk of exclusion if they stay in mainstream. And, you know, we absolutely understand that there was a time we would say that a child needed special and we would get them a special school place relatively quickly, so they would stay in mainstream until that time came. We can't do that now because trying to get a placement is really difficult, and therefore it becomes even more challenging for our mainstream colleagues. We understand that, and therefore interim home tuition has grown and grown. So we've got 151 young people on interim home tuition at the moment, and 42 of them are waiting for a tutor, so we're not providing them with education. We obviously can't leave it like that. So we are in the process of bringing another provider online to help us with that. But that comes at another cost. It's an additional cost. So, you know, what we want to do, and I hope came across a few minutes ago in our discussion, we want to ensure that the funding is being directed to the right place so that we can make a difference and that we don't have to come back here in the future requesting, you know, for difficult decisions to be made in terms of, you know, transferring money from the delegated schools budget into the high needs budget. You know, there's a lot of money in the system, and I guess we're just looking for any ideas about how we can use that money more effectively to support young people. In terms of the last bit of the report, I really just want to include this time, which we've not done previously, with something about lived experience. When we are inspected as a collective under the SEND inspection by Ofsted and Care Quality Commission, one of the things they look at is lived experience, and obviously some of that is personal testimony. People will say what their experience has been like, but some of the indicators are around mediations, tribunals, exclusions, absence. So obviously I've included some data in there, some of which has already been rehearsed in our earlier discussions. But just to point out that with mediations, Lincolnshire, we have a staggeringly high number of mediations. What I didn't put in here, but I will just tell you now, is that they're £850 per mediation. So every time we have a mediation, it's £850 plus VAT. And we've had over 230 in 2023. The national average is 35. The positive side of that is that we do resolve a lot at mediation, but I think there's still more we can do about expectation and how we can avoid getting to that point in the first place. The good news is that Lincolnshire, a lot of our mediations resolve the issue and we don't go on to so many tribunals. So we've got a lower rate of tribunal. However, in 2023, we hit for the first time again, that anybody can remember, we hit over 100 tribunals last year, and they are incredibly costly, as you can imagine. So it's another area where we're spending money. And if we can do something different earlier on to try and avoid some of that, that would be ideal. So wanting to finish on a positive, there are still positive actions. I think, there's been a lot of work that has been undertaken across the system about that early intervention, services that have been reviewed, behaviour outreach support service working together, our autism outreach, that sort of thing, to try to make sure that help is available at the earliest possible opportunity. We know that the Send advice line for Senko is still really well used and is having an impact. We track those cases. It's Kate's service that has that, but we can see that there are cases where schools felt that the next point of call with an EHC needs assessment, and actually they're not going on to that, because actually the advice liner is helping to come up with some other things, signpost, identify services that might be available. And, as we've said previously, it's not to say that a young person may never need an EHC plan, but it's about, either delaying that if it's not necessary and using some of the resources that are available, or, at least averting it if possible. And I just wanted to mention the workforce development strategy. So I do think this is a real positive. We said through the Send Alliance, the workforce development strategy is live. And at the end of December, over 5,000 modules have been completed by 75% of Lincolnshire schools that signed up to it. So, and really positive feedback. And the parent carer module, it's a sort of early awareness induction level training for parent carers has gone live as well. And I think it is important. I think the point you were saying earlier about involving parents and the earliest opportunity, what parents have fed back is that they do sometimes feel disempowered, and they feel out of their depth. They feel out of their depth when they have conversations with schools sometimes. So actually, if we can get them feeling like they understand a bit more about their young person's needs, then hopefully that supports some of those conversations. Satellite hubs have been talked about, and then just really to come back to the Send and AP change programme. So national programme, we know that there's some huge ambitions there. But I think the important thing for us as an authority, particularly with the pressures that we've got, is that the earliest we're going to see any of that is 2025. And we know, with a general election coming up this year as well, we know that any changes to legislation, should there be any, will not happen before 2027. So although there's some great stuff that is being trialled at the moment across the East Midlands as well, in terms of our partners, change partners that are leading for the East Midlands, we know that it's going to be a long time before anything else comes out of that, whether that be funding, whether that be different ideas about how we do things. So it does feel as if it's up to us at the moment to think about different ways of doing things if we can.
Thank you, Sheridan. Very comprehensive, as have all the papers been submitted. Does anyone have any comments, questions, observations they'd like to discuss? This is a supplementary report. Joe, please.
It's just looking at the figures, really. It's a question rather than anything. Because when you look at that, the split out of the need and the primary needs identified, autism plays quite a large chunk of that need. I was just wondering whether there is any collaboration between Children's Services and LPFT in terms of the autism strategy for Lincolnshire, because until a few years ago, there wasn't one at all. And I know, kind of working on a part of it, it tried to get going and then it kind of stopped. And I have to say, I don't know where it is at the moment. So it is a question. Do we work together with them to try and have a strategy that's working? Because to me, that's a big thing that would spread across all of our schools.
So just to answer that, I mean, both Kate and I are involved in the autism work as well. And yes, it is all partners. The new all-age autism strategy, because it is all age now, it's right children all the way through to whatever age. That was launched, I think it finalised at the beginning of this year, wasn't it? But there was a long time going backwards and forwards. But it mirrors the national strategy. I've been sitting on the national executive for autism as well. I think part of the problem has been still it's agreeing what are the crucial things that we're going to measure in terms of that success. And I think it's been a problem nationally, and therefore in Lincolnshire we've probably had similar problems. But the strategy is live. I think there's a lot of there's the new key working service for 14 to 19-year-olds, which supports young people with autism at a lower level of need, isn't it? There's a new virtual hub that's just come on. I'm looking at Kate because I think Kate was probably at the last board meeting.
The virtual hub, which has been talked about for some time, to support families, and it's to support families and adults with autism. That literally was launched sort of over Christmas time. They've got full staffing. So yes, it is progressing in a really positive.
Because it would be interesting to see whether we can track the positive impact of that and whether that has a difference on these figures that we see over the coming years, really.
I agree with you, Jo, and I think, you know, that because it's an all-age strategy, there are things linked to the criminal justice system, linked to employment, you know, so there's quite a number of measurable things. What happens in education is part of that, but obviously it is a wider strategy, but it has taken a long time, both nationally and locally, to agree those measurable things. And, you know, it would be probably remiss of me to say there are challenges around diagnosis still and the waiting times, and, you know, which the ICB is very well aware of and is doing, I think taking lots of steps to try and address that, but it's a challenge.
Positive that we will be able to see reflected in finances.
Any other questions?
I was just going to comment. It was good to see the tables, the data. I think that if we can do more of that, I think it will help looking at the system, because each case is so individual, so emotive as well, that it's only when you zoom out and look at the whole piece together. So I'd just comment, you know, just perhaps looking at where the locations of special schools are within the factors there, different districts will be impacting those figures. Looking at some of the proxy indicators which schools are funded on in terms of our notional send comes through Idachi, free school meals, etc. Well, if you plug those in there, you'd have an indicator actually of who's, you know, got relatively high levels of special needs compared to their notional funding, and therefore perhaps the need in the community, which could either be, I mean, it could be underreported because actually schools are finding it difficult to navigate the system, or that you've got schools coping really well. And I think within here, the real gold dust is finding out where is it working really well, where are those inclusive schools who actually are making it happen on the ground. Because if it happens there at the SEN support level, rather than getting to EHCP, you know, got real winners there for children at the end of the day about what's going on. So there'll be some of the things that I'd be looking at there, and then perhaps attaching to it your attendance data and the achievement data as well, because that's what it's about, isn't it? And we've got all of that, but we're looking at so much money pouring into the system here. You know, it's just, I think, just putting those together there. But you know, it's good to have this sort of beginning to come out now. We have to look at it in this kind of system level. Thank you for that.
Sam?
Yeah, and thank you very much for taking on page 49, where you've ranked which are the most common needs. It would be really interesting to see what they were a year ago and the year before. Only if I picked up that in state-funded primary schools, nearly a quarter of all the need is speech and language communication needs. That is not appearing in secondary. Is that about to appear in secondary, or is there something we're doing that means that it doesn't then occur in secondary? It was just a general question. I mean, is that new to be there, or because there's a lagging here, isn't there? 7 years between the top part table and the bottom part, 5 years between the top part table and the bottom part.
Yeah, and I think with the speech and language, it's coming in droves at the moment. So 2 weeks ago at 19 of the cases that were being considered for an EHC plan were little ones with no speech, language or communication.
It's a new thing coming
So
through.
we know it's coming in, and obviously there are some initiatives that are being rolled out locally and also nationally. But I think we've got all of that information. It is always about deciding which bits would go in. But I think this is really important that, you know, you're interested in digging down into some of this, because, you know, we've got all the information, but we don't always understand why. We genuinely don't always understand why it's that bad. But, you know, we know that alongside some of that speech, language and communication, lot of our primers are reporting that the children are starting, they're still in nappies. You know, there's a whole host of stuff and information that we have. We don't record nappies. We'll tell you, but we know that anecdotally that is.
Serious though, isn't it? You know, quite frankly, you're a reception teacher, you've got 30 children, you've got 4 in nappies, you've got to teach all the 30 children. So I know we've made light of that, but it's not light if you're that reception teacher. It's really, really difficult.
Yeah. And it's the knock-on, I think.
Yeah.
I won't quote it, but I remember an educational psychologist saying until a child is weaned, actually the brain isn't fully formed, developing, and therefore can't access learning. So if you have a child who's still potentially using a bottle at the age of 6 or 7, actually they're learning, they are presenting potentially as special educational needs, but it might not be. It's that developmental delay.
It's a serious challenge in the early years, stopping parents from giving their 3-year-old a gummy as they go out the door, to get them to talk to them, not their phone, to get them out of nappies before they go to school. And sometimes parents just go, "I know it's easier, just stick them in a pull-up and send it." No, it's a big challenge at the moment.
I do think, Simon, though, your insight there, you're right to spot it. So, you know, in leadership briefings, I will try and say, I think this is on the horizon, you need to be prepared for it. There is something, I think it's already known in primary, I would suggest, and very well known in early years. I think that thread's coming through into secondary, post-16, etc. And so you're right to take bits of this kind of data and reporting and try and future gaze actually what does the provision, and that's the big question, isn't it? When I say provision, system provision, what does the system provision need to look like and be to adjust and accommodate and include all of these young people with all of their differences and characteristics? Because there will become a tipping point where the high needs, special needs system will be more dependent on the mainstream system to meet need. So, you know, Tristan's heard me say this hundreds of times before. So bearing on future-proofing schools and workforce development to give people the skills and confidence, because these children are going to be in the mainstream and need to have their needs met. So how do we prepare for that? And that links back to the workforce development programme. So we've got a number of strands that we've tried to pull together to future-proof and build up, but it's an organic system that's ebbing and flowing. You know, SMH 12 months ago was the most pressing need. So you've got to keep spinning all of these kind of issues and anticipating what next in terms of what makes sense. And I think the early years part is also really important around the additionality of attendance and the capacity that brings, notwithstanding the recruitment and funding. Also things like Dingley's Promise and the key messaging from health visitors, you know, talk to your child, engage with your child, debate, you know, all of those things. You would have seen the research this week around, I think it was 60% or 50% of children in the early years not exploring or touching a book at all until probably they either go into a setting or they come into school. That will have an impact on, you know, so it's taking all of these strands together.
Just the other side of that, interesting from a secondary point of view, that specific learning difficulties is the highest and doesn't occur at all in primary, in that top 3. And so the dyslexia, the dyspraxia, the ADHD is showing very much in secondary, probably around puberty, but that's very high. And it's a reversal of what's been seen.
And autistic spectrum disorder being the highest need in special and being absent from the top 3 at all the phases. I think we might typically expect there to be a prevalence of people with autism in special schools, but for it to not even be at the top elsewhere is interesting, perhaps.
And or being incorporated into the speech, language and communication needs. So the delays with diagnosis, that would then knock on in terms of that data.
Yes.
Yeah, this kind of comes full circle a bit to what we're talking about with the behaviour needs, attendance, the parental engagement, the challenges we're seeing at school.
even at 3, 4, 5 years old are, that these children, these families are so damaged when they start. Is this kind of going back to those family hubs, and where is that what they're aiming at? Is to start.
And it's it's a strange conversation really, because if you've been in other local authority areas, we had Sure Start centres and whatnot all built all over the place. And then they were decommissioned, shall we say, nationally from different things. Lincolnshire, we kept them. We kept them as children's centres, and now the children's centres are evolving into family hubs as well. And the idea is that will go out, and it's not actually about buildings and what goes on. It's also about a family hub offer that can be digital and engaging and accessible. And it is about lifting up those expertise and expectations and accessibility to the fore around a whole host of issues, you know, postnatal, parenting, all sorts of different issues to be able to bring to the fore. But it depends all upon engagement.
It's enormous, isn't it? But in theory, if that's all done brilliantly, the other problems take care of themselves, don't they? Eventually, I realise that's very blue sky thinking. It's very interesting. Then, you know, to whatever degree that's achieved, it's going to take the strain off the sector later.
Yeah. Anything final? I'm going to propose we move on, conscious of time. The richness of conversation to information and the work that's being done, but sadly far more to do. Yeah. Is everyone satisfied with commented on and explored this in detail? Yes. I'm grateful to Steve for the consistent hands. I think we should all follow in Steve's line. Mark, you're going to talk us through the Academy and Trust update, aren't you?
Yeah, so this is a paper that we bring to the schools forum at your request. So it provides the updates in terms of the split between maintained and academy schools. So the position is at January 2024. Since the last paper that we presented in June, there hadn't been any conversions since that point. We've had one conversion to academy status, which is Spalding Monk's House. So what you'll see over page 26, you'll see the position, what that means from Lincolnshire overall. So 47.7% of schools are maintained, but actually what you'll see there is a much smaller proportion, so 26.5% of pupils. So obviously the larger schools have converted in Lincolnshire, and those were some time ago as well. Our team have considered those schools that are in the pipeline for conversions, whether that's where the governing body have chosen they want to convert, or it's actually due to coasting schools. There is a number of coasting schools that have been identified in this report. However, they don't have a preferred sponsor at this moment in time. But in terms of the projections, it's the next 6 months is looking like 2 further conversions will be taking place. Therefore, seeing the number of academies increase overall to 152, or 74% of the population. Then on page 57 in the middle, you'll see there the context in terms of those academy trusts, in terms of the number of Lincolnshire schools. With Lincoln Academy Trust being the highest, and you'll see some movements that have taken place. So in terms of a summary, we've got 36 active multi-academy trusts operating in Lincolnshire, of which they cover 154 of those 190 academies, and then the remaining ones are part of a single academy trust as well. So nothing really more to add, really. It's just an information report, no financial consequences from a local authority perspective, and clearly it's a governing body decision in terms of conversion.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone have any questions? Satisfied to know. Simon?
As the multi-academy trust numbers is significantly higher now, would it be more useful for everybody? I would find it so if as the figures go down, it's all maintained academy, that academy split as multi-academy and single academy trust. as that picture is changing dramatically in Lincoln quite quickly.
Thank you. Anything else? We're happy to note that. Yeah, fabulous. Thank you. Right, somewhere in the details on it. So the final paper you will leave to here, my voice today, that was the work programme. It's a standing invitation for colleagues to request, propose focused reports on anything that's of particular note or interest. We are asked to consider whether there's anything we would wish to add. Does anyone have a topic or a focus? If not, I'm certain Emily, Matt, you're always happy to receive those outside of meetings. So we're asked to note the work programme with no amendments at this point. Everyone happy with that? Okay, thank you. So that concludes the business of the meeting. 3 minutes to go. Hurrah. Sincere thanks to everyone for coming in.